Hello, everyone. It's a great that we can all join together tonight for one of our meeting for the series where we study spiritism connection with human psychology. In these studies, we bring together the teachings of Allan Kardec and Joanna de Angelis. I'm Fabrício Assunção from the Spiritist Society of Bournemouth in England. I'm pleased to welcome and introduce to you tonight's speakers. They are Alexandre Fontoura dos Santos and Michele Ponzono dos Santos from the Brazilian Spiritist Medical Association. Alexandre and Michele will give their talk in Portuguese, so we are pleased to welcome Dr. Dana Sissi from the Spiritist Institute in the United States of America, who will be giving us simultaneous translation into English. Alexandre, Michel, and Dan each have a distinguished background in Spiritist study, so let me say a few words of introduction. Alexandre is a psychologist, historian, and teacher. He is professor of the Spiritist Psychology of Joanna de Angelis, a member of the Medical Spiritist Association of Rio Grande do Sul, and he is also an analyst in training at the Jungian Institute of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Michele is a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, and a Jungianalist. She's a member of the Spiritist Medical Association of Brazil and the Jungian Institute of Rio Grande do Sul, and she is a teacher of Joanna de Angelis courses. Dan Assis has a doctorate in education. He is the founding member of the Spiritist Institute in the United States. He is an author and gives many public talks on spirituality and spiritism internationally. Our viewers' microphones will be on mute. Will be recorded tonight for our study. Our theme for tonight's study is pain, suffering, and plenitude, overcoming suffering. It refers to part 4 for the Spirit's book by Allan Kardec, chapters 1 and 2, earthly joys and sorrows, and future joys and sorrows. Now, let me hand it over to tonight's guest speakers, to Alexandre and Michelle, and Dan. Over to you guys.
Ok. Então, boa noite a todos. É um grande prazer.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here
Conhecidos já nossos. E dando continuidade
so that we can continue to reflect
fazer as reflexões e conectando os
on the teachings of Allan Kardec
a psicologia
and Joanna de Angelis' Spiritist psychology.
Hoje nós vamos
Today,
falar sobre o sofrimento,
we'll talk about pain, suffering, and plenitude,
que o espiritismo
and what Spiritism
dizer a respeito
can tell us
da geração do sofrimento.
about that. And hello to all of you who are here. Thank you for being here and paying attention to this maths of sort that relates to this greatest equation on earth, our identity, our history, our story, and the way in which we interpret the happenings in life and in the world. Happiness, sadness, pleasure are all terms and topics that are present in all philosophies, in all religions, in all times in our history. And in the fourth part of the Spirit's book, we'll have some information around suffering, about plenitude, or as it says, the hopes and solaces on earth and in the future. In the conclusion of that part, St. Augustine brings to us the idea that Spiritism is not bringing a different moral ethics than that of Jesus. It brings the same one, that of universal charity. That the spirits have come to confirm that and to show us its practical use, its practical utility, and help us understand these truths. And especially with these ethics, it helps us define these most abstract problems of psychology. Kardec tells us that Spiritism is the most terrible antagonist to materialism. That with fact, Spiritism kills materialism. And even if it's just that, which would be great, but it goes beyond. it talks to us about the effects of evil, the benefits of doing good, and because of it, many people have been able to improve their feelings, neutralize some of their shortcomings, and moving away from what sometimes we call evil. And that's because the future has stopped being something imprecise. It is now possible for us to see and hear from the spirits as they tell us how life is on the other side. We used to say, nobody has come to tell us about what life is on the other side. But in Spiritism, we see that happen all the time. We see spirits regret or be happy for what they have done on earth. And there is that other wonderful book called Heaven and Hell that touches upon these messages from the great beyond. And also want to remind you that the fourth work of Kardec, Heaven and Hell, can also be understood as a psychological treatise on the state of the soul. Because we'll see kings, queens, princesses, slaves, people like us, all kinds of people, and who have their lives in the world guided by their own point of view and how to relate people, sometimes with a greater clarity, sometimes perhaps touched more by their self-interest. And in that book, we see the results of that and in which condition these spirits find themselves in the spiritual world. And we want to highlight this idea of condition in the spiritual realm, because that is a way to achieve a feedback for ourselves about our souls. Because we have ways of thinking and ways of behaving that produce a energy or vibratory impact on how we register our emotions, our thoughts, and attitudes. Energies that can be destructive, energies that can be positive. And in that, we find ourselves learning how to choose better. And if there's something very powerful that the spirits can bring us from the other side and seeing the world, it is the quality of this, our inner life, of course, which has a lot to do with the idea of pain, pleasure, and plenitude. The spirit Joanna de Angelis has a wonderful book called Plenitude, in which she draws a study around suffering. In it, she starts by telling us that suffering is part of life, especially in the evolutionary stage in which we find ourselves in this world of trials and expiations, which in itself is moving towards a world of regeneration. Suffering is a mechanism of nature through which progress, whether it's intellectual or moral, takes place. To free ourselves from suffering and reach happiness and plenitude is the goal that all of us aim for. When this happiness is only tied to the transitory pleasures of the world in a sort of hedonistic mode, and this attachment to materialism, we are fated to be frustrated because these things are temporary, and when they go, they pass, we suffer. So, in this unending search for pleasure, we transfer ourselves from one sensation to another without understanding that it may create this unbalance that creates suffering in us. Our unbridled ambition for things sometimes does not satisfy us. We are not happy with what we have. We always want to make more. How many people, for instance, stop working in what they like to have another job in which they make more money? Or our hobbies that sometimes never fulfill us, but instead leave us with a certain frustration, because this hunger that the physical world has can be satiated in the moment, but later it goes away. Even with our own food, we can see this. Sometimes we eat in that moment, we're not sated. Sexually, we can also make the same bridge. We're not sated when we indulge in so much of it. And when we're searching for money and means and social position and fame and intelligence, and they travel to where they want to, they buy what they want to, they relate to many different people, and yet they still feel challenged and tormented by emptiness, by boredom, by dissatisfaction, which also cause suffering. And they also think that suffering is everywhere in the outside world, whether they're able to enjoy that which they want. But it's deeper than that. And it has to do with our inner world, our intimate life inside. When we don't find that inner meaning, these outwardly achievements, which are transitory, they lose their meaning shortly after they are arrived at. And this yields a great amount of frustrations and dissatisfactions that cause suffering. We can also pause here, Michelle, to pay attention to something so that we don't fall into the trap of being moralistic. There were times in which religions condemned every single way of pleasure. There was even a certain castration in the beginning of the 20th century that Freud spoke about as being cause of neurosis. And now we live different times where we talked about liberation, especially when we talk about sexual pleasures. And we continue to be as neurotic, full of neurosis as we were before. So the answer is not on the prohibition and not in the complete abuse. Or when we talked about Zygmunt Bauman and the liquid times, and everything is allowed and everything is permitted, which may lead it to lose its meaning. So for us to escape this moralistic approach, which will be a little hypocritical, we want to think, we want to say that we do not want to say that the physical pleasures don't have meaning. Did you think that I could be able to do this talk if I didn't drink a little coffee beforehand? Here in Brazil, sometimes we can't do this without the air conditioning because we're during summer. And that brings us pleasure in the sense of well-being. But the great question is not that these things don't have value. Of course, pleasures and satisfactions do have value. How wonderful it would be for us to have momentary pleasure and that stay with us in our soul. And that is the question. Sometimes these fleeting moments don't have staying power. It goes quickly, and it's a natural part of pleasures and moral suffering and moral enjoyment. But the really important thing is that the pleasure of the soul that stays is this moral transformation. It is how we move through between riches and poorness. Of course, we'll have a certain pleasure and certain pain, but let not us be slaves of these pleasures. Let's imagine a king in a fairy tale who is surrounded by subjects only enjoying physical pleasures. Does that work? No. How can I say that so full of conviction? Because if there's something that has been tested in our humanity, is the idea that we want to lose weight by eating chocolate. You can try. If it works, then let me know, because I want to know. But traditionally, that doesn't work. But just as it is important for us to have the pleasure, it's important for us to know how to contain that. And these two approaches enrichen ourselves. Just eating and not eating are not helpful. And so if we go back to these kings, and everybody wants to be a king and queen, that's a symbol for us to talk about. Everybody wants to be adored and appreciated, and to get in touch with multiple opportunities to have pleasures in the physical world. It's not that that is wrong, But if we stay only in that, we have a soul who has an inner world and a capacity, such as Andrea Lewis tells us, uh, an electrical capability, so to say, in the world of vibrations and perception of vibrations. So if we are not aware of this inner world, they become poor in spirit in the sense that they lack that opportunity. People who only have physical pleasures, they become vulnerable to different things. And that is part of the problems with social media, video games, which is this compulsion for enjoyment that the young people feel. But also, not just the young people, but those of us who are a little bit older, which is this addiction to this electronic media. And if they become more intolerant to frustration, what a dangerous trap. The more we search pleasure blindly, the more displeasure we end up at. So it's not a question of being moralistic to judge what is good and what's bad for other people, but to learn how to live. Because Spiritism helps us to identify ourselves as spirits, as not as matter, and that we are here in matter with a purpose. And this helps us to better dialogue with these different forces of life. And we're going to come back to this point in a little bit. I like the way you have put this, Alexander, and continuing on this line of thought. In many ways, we are very immediate. We want the things today without worrying about what's coming later. And what the spirit, Joanna the Angelis, tells us is that suffering or pain is not punishment. It is a mechanism of life in service of life. But many times we are left ourselves questioning, why do good people suffer? Why are so many things different right now in the world? We have climate change, we have wars, we have all different kinds of things. And many people revolt. There's so many wonderful people doing good things. Why do the good people suffer? And Spiritism helps us to understand that. Spiritism tells us that sincere people that work for goodness are those who, in the past, also leverage evil to improve their conditions. And they are reborn with a predisposition to doing good. And this is what we'll find in Kardec's writings. But this predisposition does not automatically entitle us to be happy. I wish to be good, to be kind, to be just, but this desire is not able to simply make it happen that we change ourselves. These are internal values that we need to develop. And as that still weighs on us based on what we have done in the past. That is because we see a lot in our mediumistic work the spirits who sometimes we call the obsessing spirits that tell us, I have found the person who in the past killed me or my family, and now they are disguised, but I find them, but I will achieve revenge. And then the person who is in charge of the dialoguing with the spirit explains, but yes, my friend, I would feel like you have, but there is a moment to think about you in this moment. Because the spirits, many times, they are right. I heard Divaldo Franco tell a story once about a American doctor who proposed abortion. Maybe you heard him hear that. And he had practiced many abortions. He had many clinics, ended up being very wealthy. But it turned out that in the middle of a procedure, the fetus grabbed his hand, and that touched his soul in such a way that he changed from that experience. He began to rethink his values, and he started to go on campaigns against abortion. But is that enough and overcome for the thousands of abortions he's done before? If we were the aborted fetus, will we forgive him
E as tantas
and the women who underwent these procedures
fizeram aborto e muitas
and
se
and
arrependem
regret,
e tem a chamada
and they have the
síndrome do
so-called
pós-aborto,
post-abortion syndrome?
só porque se
So how
arrependeu?
does regret play into that? And what Divaldo Franco explains to us
É que nós
is that
devemos
we
ressarci-lo,
have to be responsible for those actions. It's not that they're a debt, but is a reimbursement, so to say, to the universe. We have to offer resources for rehabilitation. So, in a case such like this, how can we rehabilitate ourselves? Somebody who caused perhaps many deaths, many traumas, how can he make up for this? And he continues to share that this man could perhaps be reborn as a chief of state or in a mission to save lives, or perhaps find the cure for illnesses and save thousands of lives through their own sacrifice. And so this responsibility decreases. And how many of us take with us moral debts before our consciousness and the cosmic consciousness, and in which we have the conditions to repair them? So it's not that we are demanding recuperation. It's about overcoming this. And I don't know, Alexandre, if you have heard this story and many others in which Spiritism helps us understand cause and effect. Yes, Michel, that which you're speaking of has a lot to do with what Kardec brings us in the idea of action and reaction. Kardec has, for instance, taken this knowledge that has been throughout our human history for thousands of years, and he's bringing that to us with the clothing of science, so to speak, in that moment of the 19th century. So we're not just talking only about what's good and what's bad, but we're talking about a law of cause and consequence, of action and reaction. The scientific movement that exists in our consciousness. And we understand that life is not destined only to pleasure and not only to suffering. There's pleasure and there's suffering as mechanisms for evolution. Love is perhaps the greatest feeling in human nature, and it empowers us towards the progression of our spirits. But it's also natural that in a world that's still very physical, like Earth, that if it were to place in a scale of development, it's still on the bottom rung. We know goodness and we feel it, but it does not predominate everything. Self-interest and desire to predominate over others is still the majority. Our instincts still govern over our consciousness and not the other way around. So it's understandable that we're still a little bit lost when it comes to love and suffering. And so at this level, our evolutionary scale, suffering has a very important role in our development. It helps us understand what is right and what is wrong. Would it be good to get a pair of scissors and stick it in a power plug? No, I don't know. Let me try it. And I'll tell you what is the result, if it was good or not. Of course, you will know a little bit what the result of that experiment will be. So here we test, and based on my experience, I will begin to internalize to what degree that helps me or does not serve me. So our state of, so still at a juvenile level, suffering will help us to change our perspectives that oftentimes will go unnoticed. And it will be, it remains unconscious to our development. So John Angelis brings us a position that is really interesting. That pain and suffering are mechanisms for our evolution. When we don't have the resources of love, when we don't live the resources of love, that's what happens. There's even a very famous sentence that we say in Brazil that is often said in spiritist groups. If we don't evolve through love, we will evolve through pain. Although it's very common, but it makes sense. So we have a little bit of both. In this world in which matter still dominates, everything that represents pain or pleasure is very obvious to us, and we want to avoid pain at all costs, and we want to seek pleasure at all points. We're still very identified with our physical bodies and the sensations. So Joanna de Angelis gets a quote from Kardec that suffering has a lot to do with our identification with our body. We have this fantasy that whatever it is that's good for our body is good for our souls, and that it's not always true. Sometimes we may be going through a very delicate moment physically, but we are learning to forgive, we're learning to love, we're learning to be more patient and forgiving, and developing our inner life and reflection, and know that even though things on the outside world may not be working the way we want to, we are growing. So Joanna de Angelis will tell us that the more important piece is the emotional perspective of the spirit. And she says that a brute or a barbarian spirit, so to say, will transform all its pain, suffering, and frustration into a savage or wild response, or be more aggressive, much the same way that the world imposed on it. I have the need to deal with this by hurting the world. It's a catharsis, but it's not a therapeutic one. It's one that increases my suffering. While she says that the saint or the aesthete, two words that she has chosen to those who have a little bit more consciousness, she says that the saint will transform its suffering in a proposal for liberation and happiness to other people. And so we don't need to go very far from that. Look at how many people, because they were persecuted before, they were hurt before, they're able to develop the ability to understand others, as if they were to say, you're doing something wrong. I've been in your shoes before. And from that moment, I can see how difficult it is for you. And because I went through something similar to that which you're living, maybe it's not exactly what you're living, but similar, I have empathy for you. I have a compassion for you. Even if you're right, I'm not interested in winning this argument, but to help you and help you develop this understanding in a different perspective. We can see that the pain that we suffer can be something for the same. We have very historical names. For instance, Gandhi transformed persecution in a movement of peace and love for the persecutors. He used to say that the Indians who were colonized by the English, they were poor, they were going through difficult moments, but they were in a superior condition over those who had everything material. Of course, there's a lot of different things that helped them find freedom for India and from colonization, but he brought a great perspective. Mandela, for instance, is arrested, and for more than 20 years, he remains in prison, especially because his political enemies killed his son and many people around him. But he shares with us that he undergoes a transformation, and that it was very important for him to be in that state because it helped him tame that inner beast. And when he leaves prison, he comes with a very humanistic approach that to end apartheid, the victims would need to value the aggressor. And look how dangerous and difficult that is. To understand the values of the white people in that moment, to give an example of comprehension so that they can do some healing. Because if they were to be half on the way, it's the same way, would only create another problem. And we can see here there's an inversion here. Even the psychologist Viktor Frankl from Vienna, from Austria, he goes through concentration camp. And different from the psychology of Freud and Jung, who are born in laboratory and clinics, with all credit, Viktor Frankl's psychology was born from somebody who was slaved in the concentration camp, fighting for his own life. the Nazi took him the books that he had written, took him his parents away from him, the pregnant wife who was also killed by them, and he realized that if he did not forgive them, it didn't extract value from that, he would not have meaning in his life. And so he makes from those difficult moments a deep dive into the shadows to bring a proposal for human liberation. Of course, this historical name seems sometimes out of touch from our possibilities. But this transformation happens every day in our lives when we change shadow into light. And another important detail, Michelle, is that when it comes to deep psychology, do you know that pain and suffering are not the same thing? Pain is a more of an instantaneous reaction. Somebody steps into your foot and you're going to react. There's not a lot of choice in feeling that pain. And suffering is how I see that pain, how I deal with that pain. So much so that in deep psychology, the trauma is not what has happened to me, but how I deal and read that which has happened to me in the past. And it goes beyond that. The trauma has a lot to do with how I deal with life now, how I choose to live, how I choose to face the challenges that I now face. It's how I am transforming that which has happened to me in the relation to the world and life, which really matches perfectly what the spirits bring us. The enlightened spirits, they have gone through unfathomable situations to different situations. But why is it that to be an enlightened spirit, we have to go through such hardship? Truth is that we all go through that, and they are not exempted from that either. So the psychological proposal for Joanna and Kardec is the development of this idea to liberate ourselves from suffering by understanding our life on earth, which is meant to transform our capabilities from a spiritual perspective. When we understand that the world is here to help us transform ourselves, because we're not here to stay, we'll begin little by little to dialogue with these two different things of pain and pleasure that will always be present here in material life. And we will succeed more often than not to find a relative happiness, not only the balance of our external life, of course, but also with this balance of our inner life and how we accept the world. And I'd like to add something else that Joanna de Angelis brings to us is that suffering is not imposed by God. Suffering is created by each one of us, especially because its intensity and its duration are also directly connected to our evolutionary scale, our moral resistance fiber, so to speak, and basically our evolutionary stage. And one thing that she tells us about quite often is that running away or seeking to bury that is inefficient. They are mechanisms that only delay the reality and adds up adding even challenges because we end up losing time in dealing with those pains and looking at our own hurt. So one of the things she helps us to reflect on is how we should not postpone this investigation. There's many people in the Spiritist movement, for instance, that say, I'm going to leave that to the next incarnation. That is really hard to deal with that person. I'm going to leave that for my next life. But what Joanna brings to us is that we shouldn't postpone that. That often this could take many centuries until it's possible for us to create the conditions that are necessary for the people in that particular way so that we can restore those relationships. One of these such examples is in the story of the book 2000 years ago, by the Spirit Emmanuel through the mediumship of Francis Xavier. We see a scene of Publio Lentulus, the main character, and he meets Jesus. And he can take advantage of that moment, leaving his ego aside, and take this on, but he's not able to. And in the next book, also brought by Francis Xavier, 50 years later, the name of the book, we'll see that that spirit takes more than 1,000 years to go back to the same place where he was when he missed the opportunity to be before Jesus. So sometimes when we say like, I'm going to leave that for later. But when is that later? Is it 1,000 years from now? How many lifetimes from now will we be able to be in a circumstance that is favorable for us to tackle the challenges and heal the relationships and the debts that we have? Now, it doesn't mean that we must submit ourselves to abusive relationships or situations at home to achieve this peace. We have lots of studies that tell us that it's important for us to understand that a separation is a good thing, so that that challenge doesn't escalate. But let us do our best in terms of loving to be able to face ourselves and leverage the moment so that we can heal suffering at its roots, to be able to be courageous in examining these situations, because this therapeutic effect that we get, the peace, it's a really powerful one. And on the opposite side, this feeling of anger and ire trigger these feelings and even create even more dissatisfaction. There's an expression that Joanna de Angelis uses often. She says it's dynamic resignation. That is, we should start to feel this resignation that is in an active way. It's the acceptance of the problem with an attitude that is brave in facing it and removing its causes. According to her, that is a very advanced step to solving the issue at hand. So, to know ourselves as immortal spirits that are in an evolutionary process, that have many different reincarnatory experiences, this will help us and strengthen us in overcoming our suffering, which is part of our lives. What do you think about that, Alexander? That has a lot to do with good and evil and suffering. And for us to know the two different sides of the spectrum. And perhaps as the Eastern traditions tell us about the yin and the yang, like two sides of the coin. So sometimes we have a great ability to things make more complicated. Sometimes we know that we need that resignation, but we have to also apply effort to wake up. So for instance, imagine a student in a difficult test. To be in resignation is accepting that you have to do this test and you're going to do your best during this exam. There's a very interesting book that's very interesting. The first book that Valdo psychographed from Joana de Angelis says Letters of Love, Message Amor. And many of these messages in this book, they were psychographed by Divaldo in moments in which Divaldo was suffering. And these messages recentered him, but also incentivize him to look at different ways. So she brings a sense of discipline and saying, wake up to life, and also empower him to move forward. In one of these messages, she says, you're suffering, but you're not a victim. Your pain is not the pain of punishment. It's the pain of transformation. It's the pain of reparation, of renewal, renewing pain. It's a moment of a transformation of perspectives. It's a change. So she is really trying to get him from being frozen by pain or fear because sometimes we don't want to feel any pain and we pretend not to feel it, or because we accept that we feel it and we don't want to get out of bed. So I want to go back a little bit, Michelle. This idea about identification with our physical bodies and matter. We also use the author Andrea Lewis a lot, and perhaps you may not have been exposed to the books of Andrew Lewis, The Spirit, through the mediumship of Francis Xavier, but it's a series of books that is really deep and really helpful. And in one of these books, Nosso Lar, Our Home, when he is reflecting on his experience in which he felt defeated, he dies on Earth as a scientist, a doctor on Earth that was lauded and famous to a certain extent. He was prideful, he was received many honors, he was respected but also feared. But in the spiritual world, he felt himself in a very opposite situation. So the problem was that he lived a lot his external character, but internally he did not work on his patience and his tolerance and his frustrations. His faith and spirituality had already crystallized in some way. He was a prideful man, and the more he obtained fame in science, he allowed himself certain excuses, like being arrogant. Oh, I'm famous. People have to get used to me and my habits. So, in the spiritual world, he finds himself in what we call the lower zones. These pains, this zones of pain and suffering. It has nothing to do with hell, friends, because there is no hell. It doesn't really match our spiritual perspectives. But there are places in the spiritual realms, there are transitory places where spirits come together by affinity in ways of thinking and behaving. And if it's a negative way of thinking and behaving, then there's lots of suffering. He found himself in this negative experience. That's part of our human psyche. And as he was wandering through these difficult zones, he begins to reflect. And he thinks about how he has lived. And as he opens himself to reflection and prayer, he will begin to notice his arrogance, his pride, people, things that people did not challenge him on, and that he did not want to be challenged on. As he progresses in this reflection, he says, I did not create organs for the spiritual life. Of course, he's not talking about organs in the physical body. He's using the symbol to say that he did not have an inner life, that he had not faced the great questions of the soul within himself. He had not spent time dealing with his ethical, moral questions as much as he needed. And then he said, I was like a flower in a greenhouse. And what is that? Is a term that we can say that somebody which is living in ideal conditions. But when they are in a different set of conditions, we can see that they might struggle to grow. In the spiritual world, he had connected with arrogant spirits, with spirits addicted to alcohol, and perhaps a not balanced sexuality. And that's in the vibratory range he felt himself in the spiritual world. And as his sensitivity improves, he begins to feel the vibrations that come from himself and that create suffering. Perhaps the sensitive mediums can attest to that. They may have anger and a bout of frustration at home, like all of us do. Sometimes the kids challenge us. But if we let that overtake us, that anger, that ire, the people who are more sensitive and have that aspect of mediumship, they will find this vibratory impact a little bit more severely. And sometimes we don't even realize what are we causing on other people and how we're taking things in. But if the medium has a little bit more of a self-reflection practice, they'll be able to deal that. And how about the spirits who discarnate? They feel that to an even greater extent. And that's what happened to André Luiz. And his journey is a very beautiful one. And in a way reflects that of all of us, because he begins to realize the values that he left behind. And he will begin to gather this ability to understand the other, to see the contradictions on earth, the dramas that he lived through, and see that differently. And he will find a different wisdom and derive some pleasure from that. Because as he goes through his journey, as we see in the many great religious texts, the great transformations of the soul are in his moments of reflection, of prayer, of reflection in the desert. We see Moses in the mount or in the burning bush, these transcendental moments. But also, it's important for us to value the moments of great pain and suffering. They're not only the great, wonderful moments. Buddha, for instance, in his journey, he didn't find his pleasure just in meditation and in compassion and this overcoming of the world of appearances. It was very important in his soul, that suffering, that sensibility and sensitivity he had, emotionally speaking, when he came in contact with pain and death that he did not know. He had had a shelter life, raised in a palace, raised by a loving father that isolated him from the world. And when he had public contact with the world, he saw an old man. And later he saw people who were dying, and he had not seen that. And according to the story, he didn't even know what old people were. And he was even afraid. But he was touched deeply in his emotions. He suffered because he had empathy. He suffered because he wanted to see those people better. And that's where his journey starts. And so there's a great transformation, a treasure that we find in the pain, but that is necessary for us to be aware of it, to be able to go in this path, which is also a path of happiness and fulfillment, but that comes from being willing to build this journey. And look at what Joanna also brings us. Love is the great and most efficient antidote to suffering. That which you talked about before, the relation between suffering and love. When one moves away, the other one approaches. She says that they're interdependent, that there are mechanisms of evolution. When we don't have one, the other one shows up. And sometimes they appear together. And so when it comes to liberation from suffering, she says that she tells us that that happens when we empty ourselves from ambition, when we can bring this sense of abnegation, overcoming our most immediate desires. And Joanna de Angelis tells us that integral health, inner happiness, is a result of a mental lucidity that is able to see the right acts for living a life that will then grow. And of course, traditional therapies can certainly help us recover our health and our maintenance of health, but it is only our inner factors that really are responsible for our emotional and social behavior can create permanent conditions for our well-being and really, truly free us from the causes of suffering, allowing us to bring this sense of well-being and balance. Jesus synthesized in love this great power for the nullification of these unhappy moments and for us to be able to overcome suffering with goodness. And Allan Kardec, through the study of these lessons from the gospel and of many contributions that the enlightened spirits brought him, he will talk about charity being a way in which we can grow of so-called salvation that leads us to inner health, because charity is the expression of love in its most noble expression. The practice of helping others even affects in the modeling of our spiritual body, the spiritual body that we have, and being able to correct damage to our spiritual body. So the expression of love, of service to others, has the ability to restore our health little by little. So all of us that are going through this journey here on earth, trying to overcome our pains, let's keep that in mind, that the pain that we go through today, that was built in a difficult and a distant past. We planted the seeds and now we reap the fruits. Very well. So let's start the harvest now for that which we want. Sorry, let's start to sow now what we want to harvest in the future. People say, well, I work really hard, I do all these grand things, but I'm always suffering, being hard. How can that happen? Well, but there's a time between one and the other. We need to sow good acts. We need nature to take its course and for these plants to germinate and grow. And in the future, we'll be able to harvest that and reap these rewards. Of course, we also need to bear in mind that we don't have it very clearly here on earth what kind of attitudes we had in the past. Like we forget our previous lives, the spirits tell us, because in our evolutionary level, we would not be able to handle to a great extent that which we have lived and done in past lives. Whether they were bad things, perhaps we couldn't withstand the crimes that we have perpetrated. And maybe we'd not be able to deal with the people who now we love, but in the past, maybe we're not. And even our successes too, they could also be a problem, because we could perhaps attach ourselves to things we've done in the past and would not incentivize for us to move forward. Much the same way that we think, how will I be a student in college, in our university, if all of a sudden I was a scientist like Michael Faraday? I've already studied that in the past. Why do I have to study that again? I've already done these things. Why do I need to do that again? I'd rather play video game and be happier. So it could de-incentivize our behavior. Or perhaps I can never achieve the level that I've reached before. Our vanity and our pride kick in. So even that which is good in our past could be misunderstood for us now, and we may not have the emotional ability to deal with that right now. Of course, there are people in their mediumistic abilities have even the experience of having spontaneous lifetime reflections where it comes back to them. Sometimes that's a problem too, creates a challenge. Even if these are welcome memories, sometimes they have to process that so that they don't confuse that from the reality. So you can't treat a son as your great-grandfather. And now I had to deal with my son in ways that I dealt with them. So do we really know if they were indeed the same person? Because there's a lot of fantasy out there. But even if you were, sometimes we're sabotaging a different experience because that child is not in the same place that he was before. So it's important for us to be very careful about it. And we also should try to understand the following: that life on earth that doesn't have its dose of pain and suffering doesn't have much value. How are we going to be born in this country, in this planet, to grow and not face challenges? We won't be able to find our frailties and the desire to work. And this need for our own evolutionary progress is very important. You know that deep psychology, as Jungian psychology, that Joanna de Angelis cites often, it is more connected not in the origin of pain, but where that points us to in this world. That is, if I have a depression, if I'm developing depression today because I lost my job, or perhaps I wasn't well tended to when I was a child, all that is part of life. That's what we call the etiological factor, the creating factor that creates the problem, the illness, the disturbance. Of course, that has a value, but for deep psychology, that which has more value is that where is that pointing you to? If you're developing depression, it is also putting brakes on my piece so that I can rescue within myself something that is lost. And why is it important for me to go and restore that? Because there is a better version of me that wants to live, and I need to rescue that which is missing. There is a configuration, a version of Alexander, of Daniel, of Fabricio, of Michele that is more sophisticated, that is within the possibilities of my spirit to reach. And unconsciously, I have the desire to arrive at. But for that to happen, I need to change some things. And the spirit then develops a certain sense of depression. We don't have depression just because things are not going well, but because also there is some goodness to be lived. And that has a lot to connect with what spirits bring to us through Kardec. Because the goal of evolution is this pure spirit state. We are in this physical world that will arrive, and we will arrive at a point where we will begin to evolve more independently than just through reincarnations. Until I get to a point in which my spirit does not need to incarnate anymore and my life is fully spiritual. And whoever gets to that stage, that's what we call the pure spirits, in which old languages, perhaps we call them angels, in a more mythological language. But these are the spirits who have worked to a certain extent. And in Buddhism, it's called about enlightenment. So it kind of connects to everything that the spirits bring. Of course, this won't happen overnight. We're talking about enlightenment that happens through an insight and so forth. But we can talk about a moment into which we no longer have a need to reincarnate. So many times that which we talk about, this rescue, this restoring from something we bring from previous lives, is not just if something was good or bad that I need to review it, but it's that I have a pure spirit dormant in me, and it leads me to reflect with that. It's a thirst to fulfill myself to my greatest potential. And much the same way, the instinct of the body leads us to hunger, desire. The instinct also takes us to many wonderful things. There's also an instinct of the soul, so to speak. We're going to borrow the word instinct here to say that there's one in the soul. To love and forgive is an instinct of the soul. Souls who have been hurt, they can seek revenge, they can hate. And it's even understandable that may happen. And that's part of your free will. But naturally, our souls go into suffering because in our unconscious, the unconscious, they have a need for love and forgiveness. And we can say, yes, there's people that have to go really, really deep. It's hard to see. But all dictators, all murderers, all arrogant people, or vain or prideful people, deep down inside, they have a need, a demanding need, to feel the great sensations and emotions and feelings that love brings to the soul. They're just not aware of that. And if we know that, sometimes we don't know how to achieve these things. That is why we have so many incarnations, which are different chances for us to start again, or to repair that which we did not do well, or to continue to develop and elaborate in different ways that which we had already working on in a good way. That's why reincarnation, according to the spirits, is a natural law that connects to divine justice, that connects to reason, that in different ways will be contradictory. So reincarnation would allow us to achieve in many different ways through many lives. And so that which is pain, which is suffering, begins to dilute, which is hard for us to interpret. And we'll begin to see these different things. Also, because we should not judge ourselves for seeking pleasure, but the pleasure of the soul is more important. And for instance, right now I need to reach the remote control of the air conditioning here because I need to make it cooler because it's really hot. As we were talking about Kardec and Joanna, we feel this human warmth, and the warmth in our heart is so powerful that we need to adjust the air conditioning here so that we have the pleasure of the soul. It's not to make the body an enemy or the pleasures of light an enemy. They have their importance. We shouldn't go to war over these things. We have tried that many times before in many centuries. Our proposal moving forward is to bring these things together, the things of earth and of the spiritual realm, of the spirits who find ways to find fulfillment. And Joanna de Angelis talks a lot about the psychological proposal that the Christ has brought us, in which courage has stopped being violence and aggression. It became love, and it stopped being passive, but being proactive. These are virtues without losing ourselves, are still natural in our lives. But all this confusion is momentary. Michelle, Alexander, what do you think about us opening to people so they can bring some questions to us? Even because people might be suffering by this point in time.
Okay.
We have a first question. Fabrício is going to read the questions in Portuguese and in English. So, do medical or psychiatric interventions for a person who is physically or mentally ill cause a delay in obtaining the spiritual benefits that can come from the person suffering? The opposite. Whenever we can mitigate other people's sufferings and reduce that, we should try to. Even because that suffering, and I'll give you an example of psychiatric suffering. Sometimes it is there because of a series of experiences, whether they are from previous incarnations or whether they are traumatic experiences in this life. And that by itself, that suffering, if it cannot be worked on, if it cannot lead to growth, it will not bring a great gain. On the contrary, when that is treated or addressed, when people are able to balance reestablish their balance, they will begin to print onto themselves this ability to live this balance, and they will carry that with them later. So it's very important for us to leverage all the resources we have, whether they are medicine or psychotherapy, and if we can bring all of these together, and also a spiritual support if we can, with this perspective of spirituality, then we have a wonderful kit to help people to overcome their challenges and not create new conditions that may cause them suffering. But we should, yes, use all the tools at our disposal. They do not cause delay, on the opposite. Even because then we could become masochists. Remember the first meeting we had in which somebody asked, why did Christ say, take this cup away from me? He was ready to go through that moment, but it doesn't mean it's going to be pleasant. So that moment is also very important, even from a religiosity perspective. a lot of
vida.
self pain has been created through masochism. This misinterpretation has happened in Christianity, for instance, the idea of mortifying the flesh to free the spirit.
Né? E outra coisa
Something else
que
that
é
is very
muito
important
importante,
is that even
embora nós
though
estejamos aqui entendendo que a
the
dor e o
pain and
sofrimento
suffering
eles servem como mecanismos
act as
evolutivos, talvez em
evolutionary
termos de civilização, a lei de destruição,
mechanisms,
ela também tem um papel para que
there
haja
is also a
um
role for
amadurecimento
growth and
e para que haja uma
reconfiguration.
configuração.
Let's be
Cuidado, meus
careful.
amigos. Sofrimento
Suffering by
em si
itself did
não
not
ajuda
help the
nada o
soul
desenvolvimento.
evolve.
Ele não tem
It's not
nenhum
useful.
proveito. Já que nós temos
But
essa
if we
correção
have
mais
this correction
enfática do
that suffering
sofrimento,
brings
que
us,
nada mais é do
which
que
is nothing but to
experimentar
experience something
algo
that
que
us
talvez
that we
nós não
otherwise
tenhamos
had not
compreendido até
understood
então,
until
ou
then, or we
insistimos em
insist on
qualquer
not
outra
understanding.
compreensão, a
That's
gente
why we go
experimenta aquilo
through
num
that
outro papel,
experience.
pode ser o papel do sofredor, né?
It would only have
Só vai
value
ter valor
if I
se eu
know how
conseguir
to
retirar um
yield the
sofrimento,
gain from that, if I
se eu retirar
extract from
uma
that
transformação
something
para
to
dentro
help me.
dali. Não
Perhaps
saber não é a
to
melhor
say
forma,
no
é
is
a
not the
forma mais
best way to go because
intelectual,
it seems very
como se nós
intellectually that we could
sacássemos
just click.
racionalmente.
Let's say
Vamos dizer
to
assim,
transform
se
ourselves, to
transformar,
change
se
ourselves
modificar para
because of
melhor.
that.
Né?
That is
É o
more
que é mais
important.
importante. Como eu disse,
Suffering
né,
by
o sofrimento
itself
por si
doesn't
só
help.
não ajuda nada. Né?
So
Então,
the
a
anesthesia, so to
anestesia,
speak,
né, meus amigos,
the
um
self-medicating
analgésico, uma cirurgia reparadora. Ah, mas
pain
a
or
pessoa talvez
a
não esteja para
surgery,
trabalhar tal questão. E se ela
and
começar
maybe
a ver
somebody who's
novamente, ela não vai
blind
trabalhar?
came to
Ela
learn
vai trabalhar de
something,
qualquer forma.
and if they restore
Sabe-se lá
their
se
eyes,
passar a
maybe they
enxergar
won't be
qual é a
helpful.
tela
Well,
onde
maybe
deve
it will.
agir o
How do we know?
sofrimento e daqui a
So
pouco, a
maybe from there
partir
on,
dali,
they
vai
will
ter
have a
uma outra
different experience,
experiência.
and that different
E essa outra
experience,
experiência, seja
there
ela vai
also
ter
be filled with
alegria, ter
happiness
outros
and
desafios,
pain,
né? Uma outra
to have a
perspectiva,
different
uma
perspective, to be able to
propriedade
see
a
from now
partir de
on.
agora, né? Quem não tinha o dom da visão, né?
So we're
Então,
not
nós não somos
gods to
deuses
know
para
what is
saber o que
behind the
realmente está
suffering
por
of
trás do
each one of
sofrimento de
us.
cada um.
And
Nem os
sometimes even the
espíritas que
enlightened
sabem,
spirits who sometimes
eles agem
know
dessa
act that
forma, né?
way.
Então
So it's very
é
important, and
colocar
it's a
nesse
really good
panorama.
question.
Uma pessoa, por exemplo, que se
So, for
equilibra de um
instance,
quadro
somebody
de
who recovers
depressão e
from a
consegue
state of
ficar bem
depression
com
and is able to
recursos de
restore their wellness
medicamento,
through the
por
use of medicine
terapia,
and
essa
psychotherapy,
pessoa pode passar a
they
ver a
can
vida
begin
com
to see
olhos
life with a
assim
very different
diferentes, com
perspective,
olhos amadurecidos pela
mature from
experiência
that,
e
and
ter
have
muito
more
mais
energy
energia
to
para
help
poder
other people,
ajudar
for
outras
instance, to do
pessoas, para
good,
poder fazer o bem, para poder
to
falar
talk
sobre
about
essas
these things.
questões, né? Então,
So I think, so
acho
I
que
think
Se
that's
torna
like,
tolerável, né? Porque às
you
vezes
know,
o que não pode
sometimes
ser
suffering is so
tolerante,
big we
nós não
cannot even
conseguimos nem
connect our
concatenar
thoughts.
as ideias. E
And
conforme nós
as
temos
the
uma
pain
amenizada,
lessens,
isso
it allows
permite
us
nós
to
nos
better
organizarmos
organize
melhor em relação ao
ourselves.
que está acontecendo conosco.
And
isso
that
vale para as
also
doenças
can be
físicas.
applied
Temos
to
uma doença
physical
física,
illnesses.
temos que
If we have an
tratar,
illness, we should
buscar
go
os
after
recursos
resources to
disponíveis,
treat them.
né? Eu gosto de lembrar
I
muito do
like to
exemplo
think
de
about
Francisco
the
de
example of
Assis, que
Francis
passou
of
por
Assisi, who
cada quadro
faced
assim
many difficult
fisiológico e no final da
illnesses.
sua vida,
And at the
quando
end
ele
of his
teve
life,
aquele
when he
problema dos
has a
olhos,
problem with his
ele
eyes,
aceita o
he accepts
tratamento que
treatment
é
that's available at
disponível à
that time,
época, que
which
é
is
a
the burning of his
fotossíntese,
eyes with a
fotossíntese
hot
adaptável,
iron.
né? E tem
And
um
there is a
livro
book
que
that
conta a história dele,
tells
chama-se
us it's
Francisco
called
de
Francis of
Assis,
Assisi by the spirit
Miramês,
Miramis,
e é
and
muito bonita
it's
a
a really
cena dele pedindo
beautiful
oração para o irmão fogo,
moment
né, que
when he
pudesse
prays to
atenuar
the
as
brother
dores do
fire
tratamento,
to
mas ele
improve
aceita
his
aquele tratamento.
pain,
Enfim, hoje a
and he
gente vê
accepts
nessa
that.
bucha, né,
And we can say, oh my
que na
goodness, the
Idade
medieval
Média
age
era
treatment,
esse,
that's so
mas ele
painful.
com toda a
But
grandeza
he
espiritual
accepts,
dele
with all
aceita
his
o tratamento
spiritual
daquela
grandeur,
época
he accepts the treatment available at that
nos
time
deixa
and
mais
leaves us
este
with another
exemplo, assim.
example.
Então, vamos
So let us use
usar
the
os recursos
examples,
disponíveis sempre para
the resources that
melhorar
we
os
have to
nossos.
improve.
Imagina esse sistema de saúde,
Yeah,
né?
that's
Se a gente
maybe
demora
medieval
um
care,
pouco para
right? That's not maybe the best way of treating that change the pains, but that's what he had available.
Ok, a
So we
gente
have one
tem
more
uma
question.
pergunta. Na verdade, um
It's more of a
comentário.
comment.
A Débora nos diz o seguinte:
Unfortunately,
infelizmente, a gente ainda não vê algumas falas
we don't
simplistas
see a lot
sobre
of
o sofrimento.
positions
Essa
in a simple way about
contradizione
suffering.
a mensagem sobre o bem e
What you
mal
guys talked about
do Evangelho.
reminds me
A
of
gente
the
supõe
good
que
suffering
essa
and bad
tendência
suffering in the
é
gospel.
expandir consciência e gerar lucidez.
we need experience to expand consciousness and
Débora,
create
olha que
clarity.
interessante isso que tu trouxe da mensagem do bem em nosso
Look at how
favor.
interesting, Deborah, you talked about suffering
Quando os
well or
espíritos
suffering
nos
poorly.
dizem que nós estamos num mundo
When we are in this world that we
provas,
call world of
expiações,
trials and
vamos entender
expiations, let's
duas
understand these two
termos.
terms.
A
Expiation
expiação
is
uma
an experience that I'm
que
going to
eu
go
vou
through
passar
one way or
por um meio
another.
ou de outro. Está
It's
no
in
meu
my
caminho,
journey,
nessa vida, até
in
mesmo de
my
formação
spiritual
espiritual,
program, so to
dessa
speak, to
encarnação,
go through
passar
this. It
por
has
aquilo. Tem uma
a time.
temporalidade. Eu posso
I can
passar
go through
tentando
life
lidar com
trying to
aquilo.
dealing with that.
Eu posso passar
I can
colocando fogo no
try
sangue,
to go through that by
sendo
denying and
revoltado,
rebelling
fazendo
against
algo
it, but I'm
ainda
going to
pior,
go
mas eu
through
vou
that
passar.
experience.
E já
It's
de uma
compulsory,
maneira
it's mandatory.
compulsória, há espíritos
There
que,
are
por
spirits
causa
who
da
have
consciência
a
tão
degree
pequena,
of
tão
awareness
revolta,
and rebellion, the awareness is so low,
intenção
and the desire to
de
revolt
imperar,
and
de
to
poder
prevail over
é
others
tão
is so
grande
big that
que
even if you
mesmo que
give
dê todas
all
as chances dela
chances,
se
they won't
transformar, ela não
necessarily
aceita.
want
Então
to
vai haver
transform.
uma
So
força
life
compulsória da vida
forces
que
them to
magneticamente
magnetically
atrai
attracts them to
para o
places and
ambiente aonde
situations
esse
in which
essa mesma
that
questão está sendo
that
vivida.
challenge is
Então é
being
a chamada
lived.
expiação. Então
That's
vamos
called
ver aqui.
expiations.
Doenças às
For
vezes que
instance,
nós
some
vamos
illnesses
passar
sometimes that we
e
have to
não
go
tem
through that
cura,
don't have a cure for,
ou que nós não
or we don't
sabemos se
know
vai
they
ter
will have a
cura ou
cure for
não,
or
e
not,
aquilo se dá ao longo do
or
tempo.
maybe moral
Aflições
afflictions
morais que parece que nós fazemos
that
tudo
we
que está
try
ao
to
nosso alcance para
change
mudar
and
aquilo,
seems like
parece que não
nothing is
faz a
working.
mínima diferença.
So these are
São as
expiations.
expiações. E há um
And
outro
there's a different
tipo
kind of
de
suffering,
sofrimento
which is
também, que
these
são as
trials.
provas.
So what's the
Qual é a
difference?
diferença das provas? As
The
provas
difference
são
is that the
as
trials are more
sutis,
subtle. They're
mais
more
elaboradas.
elaborate.
Que quer
That is
dizer
to
que o
say that
espírito
the spirit
daquele
already
momento
has
nesse
a certain
sentido, ele
baggage
já
in that
teve
area
aquela
and a degree of
consciência aonde
awareness
ele
in
pode
which they
estar
can
bem
choose.
seguro.
And
E
if
aí,
in the
se na
expiation
expiação o
it's
importante é
important
começar a lidar
to
na Terra,
go
a
through
pessoa
that
que não
and
tem cura,
unload
que
that
tem
on earth,
revolta, tudo
they're
bem,
going to
vai
live through
viver
that
isso
until
até
they're
gastar
spent,
e até
until they can
voltar
feel
arrependido com as
their
forças
energy
gastas e
spent
ainda
and try to
queira
change
ficar,
themselves.
né? Essa é a expiação.
Now, in the
E já a
trials,
prova
it's
é
for the learning.
um aprendizado. Então,
Not that
não que
our
os
spiritual
mentores
mentors
pensem dessa
think that
forma,
way,
mas vamos imaginar aqui.
but
Vamos colocá-lo em
it's a
prova.
test, so to
Vamos
speak.
ver se
Let's see
agora,
if
numa
during
nova
that
experiência, a
experience
pessoa vai
they will be able
conseguir
to live that
exemplificar o que
which
veio
they have been
construindo
building in the
com o
spiritual realm
espiritual
or
ao
in
longo
other
de muitas
lives.
vidas.
So in the
Então, se na
expiation is
expiação,
about how we
como nós
go
vamos
through
passar a
it
expiação,
and what
o
kind of
clima se
psychological
torna
climate,
mais
whether we are
conturbado,
rebellious or not,
menos,
whether we're going to create more
mas
debt or
leve.
not.
Quando a gente diz
Look at
assim,
what I'm
poxa,
going
olha o que
through.
eu tô
Nobody knows
passando,
what I'm
ninguém
going
sabe o que
through.
eu tô passando.
I used to have a
Eu tenho
very
aqui
dear
um muito
friend,
querido
and he
que
had a really
de uma
difficult
doença muito
illness.
difícil,
Nobody
ele dizia
knows
assim,
through what
ninguém
I
sabe o
come
que eu
and he
passo. E daí
go
ele era
through, and he was
revoltado
very
e passava
rebellious
por tudo.
towards everybody.
E em outra vida
And
ele
in
já
a
era assim
previous
numa
life, he
outra
was like that, and
dimensão.
he did not
Em
have
outra vida ele
the
tinha um coração
illness.
bem bonitão, né?
He had a beautiful
Em determinado trabalho que a gente fez
life in
sobre
a
aparecida,
previous
ele era bem
life. And
franzino,
during a
uma
spiritual
doença
session, we
moderada,
learned
profunda,
that
então ele era um
he was
alemão
very healthy in a
extremamente
previous life, and he
forte,
brought his
né? E já
fury
fazia
with
essa
him.
fúria.
So his
Então,
rebellion
essa
came
revolta
from
anterior que
before to what
puxava
he
para cá
thought was the
hoje, né?
cause. So it's about how
Então,
we're going to
nós vamos
live
passar
through
nessa
things,
expiação. E
expiation.
já a prova,
The
então,
trial,
é
however,
que
is
tipo de
about what kind of
escolhas eu vou
choices I'm going to
fazer, como é que eu vou tentar
have
remediar. E
to be
aí
able to
vamos ver que eles
remediate or
podem usar
mitigate
mais
those
ou menos
challenges.
remédio para aquilo que nós passamos.
These
Às
two
vezes tem a ver com o bem ou o mal
have
que
to
nós
do with
fizemos, né?
the
Como nós
goodness
vamos passar
or
por
the
aqui.
evil that we have created.
Então, vejamos daqui a pouco os nossos
So, for
amigos
instance,
que
we can
estão em
see our
países
friends
em
who are
guerra,
in
né?
wars and
Há
countries
alguns
where
que
there are
podem
wars.
solucionar a
Some
guerra,
countries can solve that,
mas será que todos podem ter
but can
essa
all of them
solução?
have this solution?
Daqui a pouco
And
eles
sometimes
vão
it's
falar para
hard
mim
for
que
us
não, que eles vão
to
passar
see
de
that
uma
all of
maneira
them
ou de outra.
can. And
E
so
será
during
que
this
nessa
war,
guerra,
they're
sofrendo forças
suffering things
taurinas
that
arriscadas
may
para
be
nós e
impossible
que
for
vão
us to
deixar para
understand.
nós como que deve ser
It's
vivido,
so
né?
distant from our
Tão
reality.
distante da nossa realidade.
Will
Será que eles vão
they
passar
go through that by
criando mais
creating more
débito?
debts, or will
Ou
they,
eles vão também,
through that
né, mesmo no seu
suffering,
sofrimento,
fear,
no
and their pain,
medo, na dor, estar
be
ali, meu Deus, como é que
reflective
eu
about
posso, né,
how
ajudar
do
as
they
pessoas que estão à minha volta
improve the
aqui?
situation, how they
Como é que eu
help
lido
people
com
around
isso,
them,
né?
how do
Como
they
é que eu
go through
passo
this
por essa
experience.
experiência? Há
There's
uma
so many
multiplicidade de
answers
respostas
that
que devem
that they
ser
can find in
pensadas
a
nesse
moment.
momento, né? Lembrando que,
recalling that even in these difficult moments,
os nossos irmãos, seja em
in
qualquer
whichever
lugar,
side of the battlefield they're
batalha,
in, they are
eles
going
estão
through a
passando
very
por uma experiência
intense
muito
experience,
intensa, mas que aos poucos
and
eles
that
vão se
little by
libertando
little,
disso
over
ao
many
longo dos
centuries,
séculos. Nós, como
we will
humanos,
free ourselves from
vamos
that
libertando isso
with
com maior ou
greater or
menor
less
frequência, né? tudo a ver com o
learning.
mal sofrer, nós lembrarmos,
So
né,
the
da
good
ironia da
suffering and
prova
bad suffering
e das
kind of reminds us
expiações.
of this idea of trials and expiations.
Alexandre, Michele, obrigado.
Alexander,
Estamos
Michelle, thank you very
chegando
much. We are
já no
reaching the
finalzinho
end
do nosso
of our
encontro.
meeting.
Vocês gostariam de
Would you
fazer
like to do any
um comentário
final
final
comments
para fazer o
so that we can
encerramento do
wrap
estudo?
things up?
Eu acho que cabe a
So I think
gente
it's important for us to
compartilhar
share some
algumas coisas que
things
a Joana de
that
Ângelis
Joanna de
define
Angelis
nesse, né? Ela diz
defines.
que a
She says that
felicidade
happiness
é
is to
estar
be
de bem
well with
consigo
oneself,
mesmo e estar de
aligned
acordo
with
com
the
as leis de
divine
Deus.
laws, and
E
that
que o
suffering
sofrimento
is the
é um
unbalance of the
desequilíbrio da
soul
alma que se identifica
that
com
identifies
o
with that which
impermanente,
is
aquilo que não
impermanent, that
permanece,
which is
aquilo que
transitory,
passa,
that is
aquilo que
which
é da
belongs to matter,
matéria.
attachment to
E o que são
material
as
things.
coisas
And what are the permanent
permanentes? O
things?
espírito, a
It's the
mente,
spirit, the mind,
Deus. E
values.
o que são as coisas
And what are impermanent things?
impermanentes?
Matter,
A matéria,
transitory
as coisas
things,
que
the
não têm
physical
posse,
body,
o corpo
death,
físico, a morte,
these
aquilo
things
que
that don't
não
belong to
nos
us.
pertencem. Então, a
So,
impermanência
impermanence of
de
all
todas as
things and
coisas e
people in the physical
pessoas do
world
mundo físico também se
also
relaciona
has to
com
deal with
essas
suffering.
questões do sofrimento, né? E uma
And the
aceitação do
acceptance
sofrimento
of
é um passo
that suffering
decisivo
is an important
para a
step in our
libertação também,
liberation.
enquanto a
And
rebeldia
rebellion
produz o
oftentimes
efeito
has the opposite
contrário.
effect.
Então, acho
And
que
so,
esse é uma
this is a
mensagem
message
que nós
I would like
podemos
to leave you
deixar,
with and
mas
highlight
enfatizando o quanto que
how
os espíritos
unanimous the
são
spirits
unânimes
are
em reafirmar o
and
verdadeiro
reaffirming the
ensinamento de
teachings of the
Cristo
Christ that
e que o
love
amor
is a
é uma
possible way
correspondência
for
da
us to
superação das
overcome all our pain
dores,
and
dos
sufferings
medos
and the
e da
building
construção de
a
um
healthier
crescimento cada vez
future.
mais sadio.
E que bom, né, meus
And
amigos?
friends,
Claro que o nosso encontro de hoje
of
está
course, our
muito
meeting
longe
today
de ter uma
was very
palavra
far away
final
from having a final
para
word
entender
on the
o que
topic
Joana
of
e Kardec
understanding what
nos traz
Kardec and
sobre o
Joanna brings
sofrimento,
to
a
us when it comes to
plenitude,
suffering,
a
plenitude, and
felicidade,
happiness.
né? Mas compreendendo talvez um
But
pouco
perhaps we
melhor
can
a
understand
programação que os
better
espíritos
this
trazem na
idea that
Terra
the
não
spirits bring
existe
that on
felicidade
earth we don't
completa.
have
Ela é
pure
relativa.
happiness.
Claro que não
Of
quer dizer
course,
que
we
ela
have
seja
relative
completa, né?
happiness, and
Por mais
that's very
maravilhosa que seja,
important.
pelo amor de Deus, né, meus amigos?
But this happiness is
Mas ela é
relative,
relativa.
and this
E a
full
felicidade plena
happiness can be
está-nos
found in the spirit who
evoluindo,
has evolved,
não
and that doesn't
está
take place
aqui
here
na
on
Terra.
earth yet.
E compreender essa
And to
questão da
understand this question
impermanência
of
que Michele
impermanence that
traz, né?
Michelle
Para que a gente
brought
também
to
possa
us,
fazer as
so that we
pazes com as
make
questões
peace
do
with the
mundo.
world.
Claro que todo mundo quer estar
Of course, everybody wants to
compreensível,
feel
nós
great.
sensíveis.
They
Todo
feel
mundo quer ser
loved and
amado, todo
understood.
mundo quer ser compreendido. E
And
muitas
many
vezes nós
times we
identificamos
identify
com
with
pessoas que são
people
tão
who are
belas
beautiful, have
quanto
beautiful
lindas,
bodies,
né?
and
E
in
algumas
fact,
realmente
they
são
are
lindas
beautiful in
de
their
alma,
souls, but
outras
sometimes they are
pelo
not.
contrário.
As the
A gente já
medium
vê
Francis
dizer
Xavier will
que às
say,
vezes
sometimes
surpreendia
he'll be
de verdade,
surprised by
beldades
men and women
muito
who are so
admiráveis, muito
beautiful in the
lindas,
physical
mas
world,
que no mundo
but
espiritual
spiritually
a sua
their vibration
vibração
was
era
horrible,
horrenda, pareciam
even
até
seeming like
bruxas, como ele diz
monsters
assim,
or
né?
witches in a
No
symbolism that he would
simbolismo, né? Numa
jokingly
imagem,
use.
né? Semelhante que é como se fosse, né?
Such
Tamanho
was
a
the
forma horrenda das
spiritual
suas
vibrations that
vibrações
came
das
from
suas
them.
emoções. Então, se é muito bom daqui
It
a
would be
pouco
very
nós
great for us to
admirarmos
admire
uma pessoa
somebody
famosa,
who has a
por exemplo,
beautiful
como Dom
body, who is
Manuel,
famous.
né?
That is
Entenda
nice.
assim, que bonito, né?
But let's
Mas se a
also
gente admira
admire
e quer buscar
something that
algo
is
que é
even more
mais interessante,
beautiful,
que é a
the
beleza da
beauty of the
alma.
soul.
Porque, claro, para a beleza do corpo,
Because the
existem
beauty
duas
of
forças
the
muito grandes:
body
o
will be
tempo
affected by the
e
law
a
of
lei da
gravity and
gravidade.
time.
O tempo e a lei da
Gravity and
gravidade, meus
time
amigos.
will
E
change
tudo
everything.
muda, tudo transforma.
But
E
fortunately,
graças a
the
Deus,
spirits have come to
podemos
talk
falar
to
da
us
beleza da
about the
alma.
beauty
Eu me
of the
sinto
soul,
redimido, porque eu posso buscar aonde é possível, né?
and
Porque
that's
vai
where we should
chegando uma
focus.
hora que o cremezinho,
Because at one point in
os
time, the cream, the
botox, o
Botox,
cuidado do
the
cabelo, que é
the hair,
necessário, tá, meus amigos? É
and all of this is
necessário, pelo amor de
important.
Deus, a
It's
gente tem
important
que
for us to
ter
take care of ourselves,
autocuidado,
a
um
love for self. There's
jeitinho de
nothing
si
wrong with
mesmo, não
that.
tem problema nenhum.
But comes a
Mas tem
time
uma
when
hora
that
que
is
isso não é
enough.
suficiente.
And
Mas
that
aí
is when the
os
resources of the
recursos da
soul
alma, meus amigos,
come in, and
esses são
those are
infinitos. Olha só que
infinite.
interessante, né?
Those
Esses
are
são
infinite, the beauty of the
infinitos na
soul.
beleza da alma.
And that is
Isso
what's
é o
most
que é mais
interesting and more
interessante, é o
liberating.
que é mais libertador.
So I'm
Então,
really
assim, é uma
happy to
grande
be with all
alegria
of
estar
you.
aqui com todos e espero que possam aí usar
And I hope that
esses
you may
conhecimentos que aqui a gente
leverage
pode
these
buscar de Joana, de
insights that
Kardec,
Kardec and the
hoje
Angelis
e
bring to
seguir
us
aí
so that you may
incentivados nos
feel
estudos
energized to
todos
continue to
juntos.
study the topic. So we want to thank Michelle and Alexander for the opportunity for our time here together. I also want to thank everybody who's here with us. So thank you for your presence and say goodbye.